Syria, and perhaps it's actually the one single country in the last 2 or 3 years that created all this wave of migrants coming from East Mediterranean, and perhaps confused who is migrants and who is refugee, caused quite a lot of common issue in the referendum, and having tension relation with Syria, with Turkey. But how did we get there? Not to blame, but just to understand and for lesson in the future. With all the uprisings, I don't use the term Arab Spring, in fact. Even told my young reporters not to use it at the time. With all this uprising there were various reactions, various outcomes in the short term. There's no positive outcome anyway. But in the short terms, probably to do with the nature of society of each one, with the nature of the political process, with the dominant ideology, etc., but also with intervention or non-intervention by regional and international players. When seeing what happened in Libya, which we discussed there, it was quite unpleasant and unwise, ended in tears, still is. Syria is even worse. The players or forces, especially regional ones, who were supposed to be supporting the so-called revolutions, had their own agendas, and most of them are actually far from democracy. And it's even laughable when some of them were actually supporting the rebels and say, oh yes, democracy and love democracy. There were unwise statements, unwise policies from superpowers, Europe, Britain, United States, and even gave people in Syria, rebels, false hopes, and made the regime more. And I remember, perhaps the most unwise one was actually William Hague. I remember actually in May 2011 sitting next to him on the sofa, Sky News in the morning, when I was absolutely stunned when he said there's no future for Assad, he will be gone before Christmas. I just couldn't believe my ears. The British Foreign Secretary would say that. With the people like Hoki Walker here will tell you, the Foreign Office always would say, Britain does not recognize government, recognize states, and we will support the democratic choice of the Syrian people. And stop there. And that what I was expecting to hear. And I said to him, I'm sorry, Foreign Secretary, next year we'll be sitting here, and the year after, either with you or with your successor, and Assad will still be here. And although I actually haven't been foreign correspondent for the last 17 years, but at least I claim to know the area a little bit, and I was quite stunned. So this kind of statements were actually coming from the West, more unwise from Washington, didn't help. And then suddenly we have the rise of the ISIL, the Islamic states in Iraq and Levant. And again, it's actually mind-boggling. In fact, it's insult our intelligence that the CIA, American satellites, which photograph every corner of that globe, 24 hours a day, have not actually spotted the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these white pickup trucks, Toyotas, that we all see that ISIL has been using in Syria. They were actually ordered from Toyota, brand new, specially designed with armor plates there. They've been having 23 and 33 millimeter guns mounted somewhere. They were shipped somewhere. They were unshipped somewhere down. Now, they couldn't have come through Jordan. You know the relationship between Jordan and Syria and its attitude. They couldn't have come through Iraq. Iraq has only got one port, is Basra. And the Syrian regime at the time was actually controlling all the ports there around that case. So there's only one route they would have come. I mean, at best, it's the Americans are too incompetent to be relied on if they haven't spoken. At worst, as some people in the ASC, well, they knew all about it. So they came through Turkey. There's no other way they would have come. And in fact, when I asked the Turkish ambassador more than once, he was claiming that 900 miles border, impossible to control and so on. Yes, you can smuggle 10, 20, 100 cars, but convoys and convoys of hundreds of them is just not. Now Turkey is actually our partner, EU partner, Britain's partner, in dealing with this crisis. And this question mark there have actually securing the border and reaching some kind of understanding is part of the agreement. I personally can't confirm that. Then we come to the other point. Until the Russians intervened, the game is totally different. Russians actually have changed it. The Russians have got their own reasons, of course, not to be trusted, etc., but they have legitimate concern that they're actually fighting Islamic terrorism in their own soil. Very thousands actually of Russian nationals or nationals from Russian Federation, different countries are actually there, so they have their own reason. Obviously, they have their base around Tarsus, which they are not going to give up. So these realities we have to recognize and to have to work with the Russians. And it's a great folly to link the Ukraine crisis, the new Cold War, with the Syrian crisis. Without actually cooperation with the Russian, the Syrian crisis cannot be solved. And then we come to the subject we're talking about, the migrants. But for a reach there, you have to get two issues: dealing with the migrants and the refugees, and reaching settlement there. I've been caught on television programs or give talks and so on. Every time there is the Geneva, and then you get part of or one element or two of the Russian or the Syrian opposition would either walk out, not attend, whether they are coming from Doha or from Riyadh, depends on who's supporting, sponsoring them, they walk out. And my advice I would say, no, don't walk out, stay there and talk with them. We had that lesson that the Palestinians actually learned, but now unlearning it, that actually without a direct talk, you cannot actually achieve any peace or settlement. Yes, you can stay, you can stay in your position, stay in the room, but don't walk out. There's something really, maybe the afternoon panel can discuss that. Then we'll come to the refugees and migrants. It's a big issue because no European government will be able to convince the public, the voters, regardless of the moral aspect of the argument. The political reality on the ground, no European government is actually going to be able to convince the voters to accept this unlimited number of people, that regardless whether they're refugees or migrants. And then we get the issue that, yes, most of them wanted to go back, so that's actually afterwards. And again, I am for the realistic view that you have a processing centers there in as near to the border as possible, and I think the British government is doing the right choice of actually aiding and helping in Lebanon, in Jordan, those in need for medical treatment, those in need who cannot actually go back for various reasons, children without parents and so on, come from their camps in order to discourage the people, smugglers and so on. It's a different issue. I'm not going to deal with it now because you can't deal with it without actually ending corruption in Turkey, and you have to have some willingness from the Turkish government. The Turks are actually using this issue to blackmail the European Union in various concessions. So going back to offering some kind of realistic, to borrow Italian expression, make them an offer they can't refuse, which is an aid for the processing centers in Turkey itself. Again, that's something for the afternoon panel to discuss. And again, I must emphasize on security, fighting the Islamic terrorism, ISIL has to be a priority, and that cannot be done without pressurizing regional players, especially Sunni Arab countries, and cooperation with Russia.
Thank you, Adel. Adel is a wonderful journalist, and really, we call guys like Adel hacks. It seems uncomplimentary. It seems. I mean, it's a good expression. Real professional journalist of the old-fashioned kind, and it's wonderful to have him with us. I'm going to introduce the panel chairman, who will now take over. Before I do, some of you will see these documents on your chairs. They're not from us, nor are they from anybody who will appear on any of the panels. They're from a gentleman who's not in the room as yet, but I don't think he's here, Mohammed Al-Gabra, but who will appear later in the day, who represents one of the Syrian opposition groups, and asked us if we would put them out so that you could give him some feedback. So do feel free. He'll be here, no doubt, shortly. I think one or two of our friends have had difficulties with the trains, and so they are on their way. But so that's just to say, we're not disowning it, but just to say that I'm sure it's an excellent proposal, but he wanted it shared with the conference. And now we turn to our chairman, and who will take over. George, I'll introduce George. George Butler is unique. Unique in all the world. He's possibly the only war artist in the world. And his work is astonishing, and it is really remarkable. There is a book just outside, I think, on one of the tables, and you can see some of his work. It really is quite exceptional. Anyway, George, that defines him. His work as a war artist. He also helps run, indeed helped found, a small charity, the name of which is
Hands Up.
Hands Up, which provides medical relief in Syria, and medical equipment in Syria, not in war-torn areas of Syria, so that's a wonderful effort too. So bless you, George, and thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. Do I need to press this button on?
Yep.
Is that on? Great. Thanks, William. Thanks, Adele, for that. So we're talking about the situation in Syria today in particular. And I think, well, the brief that I got was a good one, and that is that given the knowledge on this panel and also in the room, looking at a lot of, sort of faces that I recognise from these sorts of things, we should try and guide our conversation towards offer information for solutions to some of these problems, and not just discuss all the things that a lot of us already know. We've heard from Adele. Amar will talk a bit more about the failed state there, and particularly the role of the international community. He runs a company called, correct me if I pronounce this wrong, Gnosis, and perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about that. And then we'll hear from Dawn, Professor Dawn Chatty, who is going to, well, I think it'd be silly not to hear her talk about refugees, although not technically all inside Syria. So we'll hear from her about that. And then if we can do 7-10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to everybody and encourage everyone to answer everybody's questions.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Ammar Waqaf. I'm Syrian. I came to Britain in 2004, so it's been a while. usually a soft speaker, so terribly sorry about that. I will do. Okay. Right. So my name is Ammar Waqaf. I've been here for about 12 years. I've been heavily engaged with the situation in my original country, Syria, which I still call my home country, by the way. I represent here today, and I hope to bring you the perception of the people who felt, or who felt a threat from the uprising and from the entire movement that was called the Arab Spring in 2011. This point of view isn't very well portrayed in the media, yet there are people in Syria, believe it or not, who send their children to die in a battlefield in order to guard their interest, and their point of view needs to be heard. The essence of the company that I founded recently, Gnosos, is exactly that. There are conflicts in the world, Ukraine, Darfur, the Balkans, whatever it is, and there are always another side of the story that we rarely hear about. And people need, and I think it's our interest to know what the other side of the conflict really thinks about, and not to put them as, in a very simplistic way, as either non-existent or wrong. So what I'm going to do today, hopefully in 5 or 10 minutes, probably less than 10 minutes, is to explain from the perception of those Syrians why things have developed, i.e. a bit of a run of the situation in Syria from the point of view of Syrians who do not like the revolution or who think about it as a threat, and B, come to the immigration or migration problem or refugee problem and think about it in similar terms. So first of all, when the uprisings in the Arab world unfolded in late 2010 and start of 2011, there was a big apprehension in Syria amongst Syrians whether we should do something about it and, you know, ride the wave and do the change that we've always dreamt about. There was a lot of skepticism about who's running the show. Is this really a conspiracy by the West again, or are the Gulf states jumping too soon into the events in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and trying to expand their geopolitical influence or not? And whether we, as Syrians, would want the same to happen in our country. Because of the nature of, or the predominant nature, I have to say, I have to correct, the predominant nature of the uprising in Syria, many Syrians thought of what happened or saw what happened as a threat, mainly to their interest, to their status within the country, and in extreme cases for their existence even. And they decided that this revolution was not a very good thing, and they need to defend themselves against it. And so the only way, or the best way possible for that, against the odds, was to uphold the state, man its institutions, most notably the army, and basically defend themselves. The lines along which the society was split in Syria are often highlighted as sectarian lines, i.e. Sunni versus Shiite, or in Syria's case, basically Sunni versus Alawite, but this is not true. A lot of Sunnis also saw a threat, but a different kind of threat than the minorities saw that. In the case of Aleppo, for example, this was a rural area versus an urban area, and the urban population of Aleppo saw, well, we're not going to have any of that, so let's resist that. So what we have in Syria along the way is an uprising by a significant part of the country against another significant part of the country that has always seen this as a threat that they need to defend themselves against. Those people support the state, not because they like the state, not because they think President Assad is the best person in the world, although some of them actually do. They think that he is the best person to lead a coherent government that would eliminate the threat or fend off the threat. Any other person in that particular position wouldn't do or would not be perceived to do as good. That's why basically President Assad is still in power, in my opinion, and in a lot of people's opinion. What we have today is a clash of projects in Syria. This is what, after 5 years of continuous clashes, this is what has stemmed into type of clash of projects. The opposition project is predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly, unfortunately for all of us as Syrians, is one that is based on a view of the country based on Sunni-Shia lines, i.e. very similar to the political position or situation in Lebanon or currently Iraq. That is how the Syrians who support the state view that project. And that project, not the people who carry it, but that project needs to be defeated. That's the prevailing thought at the moment. Coming to the migration issue, those people who ran off the borders to Jordan, Turkey, even to Egypt, Iraq, and Lebanon, some of them were hoping for a better environment. Some of them felt some threat, and they're both either with pro or against the government or anti-government. And some of them were real refugees, i.e. the areas had some clashes. You had the state bombing. You had Jabhat al-Nusra coming, and they didn't particularly like to live in that environment, and they thought, let's just get out of there. There are internally displaced, the internal refugees within Syria at one point were twice as much, when the external refugees in Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan were about 4 million. The internally displaced were about 8 million. And these are from the eastern areas, the southern areas, who sought refuge in the government-controlled areas. Now, the next step for those refugees was to migrate to Europe. I think once they took off for Europe, they were not refugees anymore, in my humble opinion or definition. They became migrants. And the key factors are opportunity, in a sense that there is a door that suddenly is open that we need to take advantage of for the sake of our children. And this is illustrated, for example, by the fact that some Syrians who didn't really need to migrate from Syria, or who were, for example, living in the Gulf, well-off people, very much established in the Gulf, like 20 years or 30 years in the Gulf, they thought, well, Germany is opening the door, let's just go there and seek asylum. Why? Because there isn't much stability for their children in the Gulf. They might be prevented from getting a visa for the second generation, and then they might have to go to Syria, and Syria might still be riddled by conflict, and they would want to have a better option. There is also people who have hope in Europe. They feel disengaged in what happened in Syria and think that this is not my country anymore. I deserve better. I deserve a better future. I can mingle, I can integrate with the Europeans. I have enough skills to integrate within the European society, so let's go. And there are also the classic refugees who were probably living in refugee camps around Syria, who thought that what the hell am I doing here? What future do I have? Let's just take the boat. The way I personally look at this, just to finish off, is that I actually look at migration into Europe from a developmental point of view, just like I did very voluntarily. I came here to expand my horizon, to learn a little bit more. I think everyone deserves that chance, and I think that would benefit Syria on the long term. So I would welcome these refugees. I would give them actually a space and look at them, not from a settlement point of view, but let's just raise your skills, help you become, better citizens in a sense, and why don't we prepare you to go back to Syria and serve your community and country in a much better way. Thank you very much.
loud enough, or maybe do I need to bring the mic closer? Okay, I'm going to start first with some very personal comments and observations before, as to how we got to 2011, to the events, as most Syrians will call what we are regarding as a civil war or an uprising. And then I'd like to focus on what displacement and dispossession actually means in terms of this humanitarian crisis, which is the Syrian humanitarian crisis, which is often being sort of put together with the migration crisis, which hopefully I can show you are really two very separate things. I spent my childhood in Damascus. I grew up during the period of Republican government of the 1950s, when there was a constant in and out of elected government with military coups and so on. In fact, there were so many military coups during that era that I had been trained by my parents that when I walked home from Baghdad Street up to Rauda, that if I saw a lot of men, long line of men standing outside a bakery to buy bread, that I needed to run home, because that was an indication that there was another change of government. So very frequent changes of government, quite bloodless. A few tanks around the radio station, and then another few tanks around the presidential palace. In my late 20s, I was very lucky to win a Fulbright award to come to Syria and to teach anthropology in the graduate studies in the liberal arts. It was the first Fulbright in anthropology, and in fact, Ambassador Murphy, I think, supported that, but he was also surprised that the Syrian government of Hafiz al-Assad had okayed the project. But my focus was on the Bedouin of the area between Palmyra, Salamiyya, and Homs. And it was very clear the government had no interest in the Bedouin at that time, and so it was felt that that was something that I could study. So I had 2 years working with young scholars in Syria, and also at the time adapting to some of their fears and concerns. I remember thinking that everybody was very paranoid at the beginning, but after my 3rd or 4th trip to the airport to fly out to a conference one place or another, I began to take on that same terrible sense of insecurity as I approached the immigration guards, wondering whether I was going to be allowed to leave the country or not. And this is just carrying an American passport. But what I want to say is that during the period of Hafiz al-Assad's rule, people lived with great fear, but they also learned how to live with a government in which the security forces were really all powerful. People understood how to keep their heads below the parapet. If you didn't cross a red line, you were okay. You really didn't know what the rules were, but you just hoped that you were never going to infringe upon those rules. I say this because in 2007, 2008, as Iraqi, mainly Sunni Ba'ath Party holding Iraqis fled from Iraq into Syria. They were very clever. I'll go back later on. They refused to accept the kind of assistance that the United Nations Agency for Refugees wanted to offer. And they dispersed throughout Damascus, throughout Aleppo, they went to Amman. And they also knew the rules of the game. You know, don't stick your neck out. As long as you don't become obvious to security services, you can do what you want, you can buy apartment buildings, you can set up businesses, you can do whatever you like. However, Bashar al-Assad, taking over from his father, certainly seemed to want to portray a much more modern, progressive outlook, and introduced in some ways a kind of neoliberalism, or maybe crony neoliberalism, introduced IT services, gave the sense that he was liberalizing the country. And in that effort, he allowed the UN Agency for Refugees, UNHCR, to operate in a large way in Syria to register Iraqis as refugees, and I'll go back over that terminology in a minute. And in that act also, the UN agencies had to hire many young nationals. And so I would say a large number of young educated Syrians began working with UNHCR. And one of the most important messages that we have in our humanitarian model is that refugees have human rights. And so suddenly in Syria, there was a category of people, the Iraqis, who were being registered as refugees, and they had human rights. That they couldn't be returned, they had to be provided with assistance, they were also getting provisions from the World Food Program via ATMs and so on. And my belief is that this was a point when that young Syrians began to think, how come Iraqi refugees have human rights, but we don't? They have protection, and we don't. And I regularly go back to Syria. I, in fact, used to do an annual workshop on Palestine refugees and international law. And I began to observe a larger and larger group of young people becoming interested in civil disobedience. Now, I have to say that I was in Syria in March 2011, and I was staying in the same research institute as Lisa Wedeen, a political scientist from Chicago, who was giving lectures supported by the American Embassy on civil disobedience. And much to my chagrin, her audiences were much larger than mine. But I remember being really perplexed that the Syrian government was permitting this kind of activity. At the same time, I was a very good friend of one of the Atassi sisters who was mounting demonstrations in front of the Ministry of Interior. She was constantly being arrested and then released, and eventually in February of 2011 she went on hunger strike, and I remember hearing the kind of deal that she was eventually offered, that she would be allowed to leave, to be released from prison as long as she left the country and went to Lebanon and joined her son, which is one of the things she did. So all I'm trying to say is that there was a very big build-up. I don't think it just started with Tunisia and Egypt, but I think actually that the refugee crisis from Iraq had a great deal to do with educating Syrians into what they didn't have, what they were accepting in order just to maintain the status quo so that business continued as usual. So that's my background to that. And then just to add a little bit more, in my visits, I annually was back in Syria throughout the 1980s and 1990s. I do recall very strongly in the 1980s a growing influence and presence of Iranian pilgrims, also of Iranian money in buying up large areas of the Old Quarter and creating huge shrines for some of the important figures in Islam, like Siti Raqayya. And not long after that, seeing a lot of Saudi money come into the country, setting up what I'm going to call sort of neo-Salafi kind of educational centers, the Abu Noor foundations, and seeing a kind of conservatism grow. It was almost as though the Iran-Saudi Arabia contestation began once Khomeini had displaced the Shah, and Saudi Arabia reacted to that. It was a battle over the hearts of Syria. So let me just now turn to the displacement crisis. So this, the uprising or the events, the demand for greater social freedoms, for dignity, for justice, became violent very quickly. And I would say that the first displacement was internal. In most refugee crises, in most civil wars, people leave areas of conflict. If their house is blown up, of course they have to leave. If their neighborhood is under stress, they leave. So there was a great deal of internal displacement in Syria first. But because a lot of the fighting moved up towards Aleppo, Idlib area, the first really big wave of people displaced from Syria was into Turkey. It was into the Hatay province, which, as you know, was part of Syria until 1938. But the more important point is that the Hatay province is made up of almost a microcosm of the Idlib-Aleppo area. So people were moving to friends, to relatives, to others who they knew they could support, and they also knew that they were moving to an area where Arabic was spoken as much as Turkish was spoken. So this was the first place where people moved. Those who went to Lebanon eventually, when the areas of Homs were completely destroyed, again, they were moving to an address that they already knew. I mean, I think some people have already given these facts and figures. I won't go into all the numbers, but let me just say that Lebanon, during the times that its economy was booming, had at least 500 to 600,000 workers from Syria in the construction industry and in agriculture. So if you add these workers bringing their families over to keep them safe, then you get your figure of 1.5 million. Jordan, very similar. Most of the Syrians who eventually fled to Jordan were from the Dar'a region, and many of them were tribal. Many of them were from the Bani Khalid, and they were joining lineages and seeking the hospitality, which is part of the traditions of these cultures, particularly the requirement, the duty to be generous, the duty to provide asylum, rather than the human right of the person who has been dispossessed. So I'm worried I might be running out of time, but can I just make three big comments? I think there's some very big issues to think about. Syria has nearly 7 million people displaced in the country. They haven't crossed an international border. This is very large when you consider that there are areas of aerial bombardment, of continuous armed conflict. It also has about 4 to 5 million Syrians who have crossed a border. In Lebanon, they don't want to be called refugees. They prefer to be called displaced Syrians. And in Turkey, they are also just Syrians. Jordan also calls them temporary guests. Of course, none of these neighboring countries have signed the 1951 convention, so none of them are really obliged by the mandate that sets out. Most Syrians want to stay near the border. They prefer not to cross the border. The widespread fear that once they cross the border, if Bashar al-Assad's government doesn't fall, they may not be able to go back. And there are many discussions now taking place about the transition plan for Syria in the future under Bashar al-Assad and some kind of compromise, which will start with only a population of 15 million, meaning those who've crossed the border can forget about going back. So in a way, the Syrian population always feared becoming Palestinized, and maybe that is something that we'll see happening. But I want to talk about camps. The United Nations Agency for Refugees was invited to set up a camp. Now they have 3 in Jordan. Lebanon has no camps. Turkey refused the assistance of the UN Agency for Refugees and said we would set up our own camps. Out of the 4.5 million Syrians who are in neighboring countries, only 10 to 15% are in refugee camps. Those in Turkey are classified by the International Crisis Group as 5-star camps. They're laid out as large villages of 10,000 people each. People can come and go each day. They can also ask for leave of absence for 3 weeks at a time if they need to go back to Syria for something, because the circularity of movement is very common among Syrians. But the camps in Jordan, which are the most unpopular, that we hear a lot about, Zaatari camp, is really a high-grade prison. Once in, you can't get out. Or I should say the only way out is to buy somebody to smuggle you out with a kind of a sponsorship, or to find somebody to marry off a daughter if you have a daughter. It's a place where the Syrian has to take on the role of the passive, vulnerable refugee as developed in 60 years of which the UN agency, UNHCR, has worked. And most Syrians reject that model. They want to be agents of their own faith. They want to be able to support themselves. They want to be able to work. But the reason why neither the camps nor the containment policy that we see is working is that Syrians are not permitted to work in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Turkey. In Jordan, Syrians who work are criminalized, and they're liable to be picked up and collected by the police and deported. Now, for Syrians, deportation means put into the Zaatari camp or thrown across the border, because Jordan is deporting, it is refouling, and it's also preventing Syrians who are trying to flee continuous conflict from coming into the country. So containment is not going to work. People are not going to see themselves starve, if I can put it that way. Very few are actually in camps. They're going to find a way out, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this continuous flow of Syrians to Europe, across the land bridge or over the Mediterranean. Maybe we can come back to that later on, because I'm running out of time, am I?
You're right.
Okay.
You can have some of my time.
Adele, would you like to follow that quickly?
I'm in total agreement actually with my fellow panelists, so I'm going to continue what you say, not going to contradict anything. Just my observation again on when you have dictatorships like Hafez al-Assad, although his son Bashar came down, he's trying to open up a bit. We, in fact, organized a trip with William, went there, I think it was about 10 years ago or so, when we had a visit, which was one of the opening. And they were giving, as a journalist, I tried several times, they didn't give me a visa, but I remember on that actually day, I think thanks to the President Bashar Assad's father-in-law, who helped us, which gives an idea of how Syria was run, almost like one of those families we've seen in Francis Ford Coppola's films, and not quite sort of proper organized way to run a modern state. And again, there was sort of, when you have this kind of, there's no civil society as such, no political party allowance, you have this polarization of ideology, and the organized and powerful ideology was the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic fundamentalism, which is a fascist, seriously dangerous ideology. So the choice between the two really is not sort of a pleasant choice. What does it mean? It means when the uprising happened, and actually uprising is strange, it's different from the uprising that happened in Egypt, different from the uprising that happened in Tunisia, because it happened in different geographical areas for different reasons. Some were tribal, some were ideological, but the dangerous thing was quite a lot of Islamists, even in the very, very early days when they started some kind of violent suppression from the regime. You hear the shouting and the slogans in Arabic, very Islamist orientated there. So there was no projects of reform even before revolution. And as you said, when Bashar opened, we was quite fascinated by the internet and the computers and all of that. One of the things we were actually told and shown when we went there. The problem with the social media, like Facebook, and so even you see it in even sophisticated societies like here in the debate over the European Union here, it is actually creates rebels without causes. You have people who sort of start chiseling into the moral and cultural and intellectual beings of the whole structure of society, chiseling it away, knocking it down without really presenting anything positive. And so and I'm totally in agreement again when various people see themselves as they're going to be harmed, as their interests are going to be destroyed, and if you are running a service industry, if you are in the hotel entertainment business, if you are in the restaurants, you don't want the Islamists there because they're going to ruin your livelihood, let alone actually your safety, or tell you how to eat and rest and drink and all of that. So that's why the regime gets quite a lot of support from there. Thirdly, which I actually had mentioned again, the neighbors, when they intervened, I mean, none of them really have any democratic sort of history or any credential to claim they actually supporting a change for democracy and the human rights. And as we heard from Dawn, because none of them actually signed the refugees treaty, international one, let alone opening their doors and taking some refugees, even on a temporary basis. And again, as we heard from the figures there, the whole attraction of leaving the country or coming to work in Europe, and so this is something here which is making confusion. Who's a refugee and who's a migrant? Again, you correctly said genuine refugees wanted to stay as close as possible to their home and return back. Now, but I'm actually interested for the future, and I again emphasize again, the cooperation with Russia is very, very important in order to destroy the Islamic State there, because without destroying the Islamic State, there's no way into it. And then reality check, what are you going to do with the regime? The whole demand of the regime must fall and be replaced, that's totally unrealistic now. There has to be some kind of accommodation. That brings me to the internally displaced. And one of the clever things was suggested is not National Security Council resolutions of actually refugee agencies helping the safe corridors and so on. That can be, again, without Russian help, that cannot be achieved. But for the carrots you're going to give to the regime for the future is a Marshall Plan for Syria. And I think you got the idea from what you said in the internally displaced people there. Offer of rebuilding Syria once it's settled, that actually would help the regime to find a way, a formula, a face-saving formula of getting rid of Bashar al-Assad himself, keeping the regime intact, but without sort of humiliation, guaranteeing he's not going to be subjected to being put in jail, going to be in criminal court or something. I'm not saying that in defense of him, but just reality. I mean, what's better is actually put him away in exile, or another 6 months down the road, and then another 50,000 people get killed. We have to be realistic about the things. So actually offering the regime some way out, as well as carrots in a form of a big Marshall Plan to rebuild Syria. I'll stop there. I think we'll hear from the.
Great. Thank you very much.